The slap echoed louder than the room expected. 30 witnesses froze. Bumpy Johnson didn't move, didn't blink. He just looked at the cop like time had slowed to see who'd regret this first. The room was already tense before the slap. Not loud, not chaotic, just tight, like everyone felt something waiting to happen, but didn't know where it would land. Bumpy Johnson stood near the center, relaxed in a way that unsettled people who didn't understand him. His coat was clean. His hands were empty. His face carried no expression that could be mistaken for weakness or anger, just presence. The cop had been talking too much, laughing, leaning in close, letting his badge hang where everyone could see it. A badge used like a shield, like permission. He said something sharp, something meant to cut, something meant to remind Bumpy who the law claimed to belong to. No one laughed. 30 witnesses stood there, men who knew violence, women who knew consequences, faces that had learned when to look away. Every one of them felt the shift. The invisible line was right there now. And then the slap. It wasn't dramatic. No wind up, no rage, just a flat hand across Bumpy Johnson's face. The sound cracked through the room and kept going, bouncing off walls, settling into chests. A sound that demanded a response. Everything stopped. Breathing paused. Eyes widened. Someone's chair creaked, then froze. This was the moment people died for. The moment guns appeared. The moment Harlem stories were born. But Bumpy didn't move. His head turned only slightly with the impact, then came back to center. He didn't touch his face, didn't step forward, didn't step back. He looked at the cop, not with hatred, not with surprise, with study, like a man watching someone sign a document they hadn't read. The cop smirked. He waited for the explosion, for shouting, for fists, for the mistake that would justify everything he wanted next. It didn't come. Bumpy's eyes held him there, calm, heavy, unrushed, the kind of calm that doesn't beg for control, already owns it. In that silence, everyone understood something without saying it out loud. This wasn't over, but it also wasn't going to happen here. Bumpy turned his head just enough to look around the room, at the witnesses, at the men who wanted to move and didn't, at the people who knew better than to interfere with a moment that didn't belong to them. Then he did something worse than retaliation. He smiled, not wide, not friendly, just enough to let the cop know this slap wasn't power. It was a mistake, and mistakes didn't need to be corrected loudly. They only needed time. Bumpy adjusted his coat, stepped past the officer without a word, and walked out as if nothing had happened. Behind him, the room stayed frozen, because everyone there knew the truth. The slap had landed on Bumpy's face, but the consequence had already landed on the cop's life. Harlem didn't need explanations. It never had. By the time Bumpy stepped back onto the street, the neighborhood already felt different, like the air had shifted without anyone pointing to the sky. He didn't look angry, didn't hurry. His pace stayed measured, almost polite. That's what unsettled people the most. Men on the corner stopped talking when he passed, not out of fear but recognition. They knew that look. They'd seen it before. Calm didn't mean mercy. Calm meant the decision had already been made. Bumpy wasn't a man who proved himself in public. He didn't shout to remind people who he was. Harlem carried his name for him quietly, carefully, like something valuable you don't throw around. Shopkeepers nodded as he went by. No words exchanged, none needed. Respect lived in the silence between them. He had kept order when chaos would have been easier. He had settled disputes without leaving bodies in the street. He had made sure money flowed without poisoning the block it came from. That's why no one rushed to defend him in that room. Not because they were scared, because they trusted him. They understood that if Bumpy didn't react, it was because reaction wasn't required. Violence was a language he spoke fluently, but it was never his first choice. Violence was expensive, sloppy. It echoed too long. Control was quieter. Some men ruled by fear. Those men needed reminders, needed noise, needed blood to keep their names alive. Bumpy is ruled by memory. People remembered what happened when you crossed him, and more importantly, what happened when you respected him. He protected Harlem from outsiders who thought the neighborhood was soft. He checked his own people when greed got loud. He balanced things so the streets could breathe. That balance mattered. So when word spread about the slap, and it spread fast, it didn't turn into outrage. It turned into something colder, more deliberate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes narrowed. People asked fewer questions than usual because everyone knew the cop had misunderstood something fundamental. You could insult Bumpy Johnson. You could even hit him. But you couldn't escape the way Harlem responded afterward. And Harlem always responded together. No meetings were called. No orders given. Bumpy didn't have to say a word. His restraint was the message. It told the neighborhood everything it needed to know. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't about revenge. It was about respect being violated in front of witnesses. And in Harlem, witnesses remembered. The cop thought the slap ended the moment. Harlem knew it had only started it. The cop walked away feeling taller than he was. Back inside the precinct, he told the story like a joke, a good one. He leaned against desks, laughed too loud, reenacted the slap with a grin, made sure everyone knew who'd been standing there, made sure Bumpy Johnson's name came out of his mouth like it didn't carry weight. He wanted applause. What he got was silence. A few officers smirked. A few looked away. The older ones, men who had learned the city instead of trying to dominate it, said nothing at all. They'd seen this before. Different names. Same ending. But the cop didn't notice. He never did. He mistook restraint for surrender, mistook stillness for fear. In his mind, power only existed when it made noise, when it is humiliated, when it proved something in front of witnesses. He didn't understand the witnesses had already chosen their side. Outside the precinct, the city began to answer him in its own way. Nothing dramatic, no threats, just absences. A call he usually got returned didn't come back. A door he walked through every morning stayed closed. A nod from a man who once looked the other way disappeared. He blamed coincidence. Corrupt men always do. He kept pushing, leaned harder, wore his badge louder, stopped cars he didn't need to stop, asked questions he already knew the answers to, trying to remind the city who held authority. But authority doesn't come from pressure alone. It comes from permission. And Harlem had quietly withdrawn it. The cop felt it in small humiliations. A bartender refused to serve him, eyes steady, polite. A shop owner closed early when he walked in. Informants suddenly forget names they used to know by heart. Nobody said Bumpy Johnson's name. That was the worst part, because it meant this wasn't personal anymore. It wasn't about anger or ego. It was about order correcting itself, about a man learning what happens when you embarrass someone who never embarrasses others. At night, the cop replayed the moment, the slap, the stillness afterward, that look Bumpy gave him. He told himself it meant nothing. But something had already changed. The city wasn't watching him anymore. It was waiting. The pressure didn't come like a threat. It came like silence settling in places where noise used to live. Bumpy Johnson never sent a message, never asked for a favor, never raised his voice in a room where decisions were made. He went on with his life exactly the way he always had, measured, deliberate, unbothered. That was the pressure. Because when a man with power does nothing, people start filling the space for him. The cop felt it first in routine. The small rhythms that made his job easier began to collapse. A name that used to open files now got him nowhere. A phone call rang too long before someone answered, and when they did, the tone was different, careful, distant. He leaned on old connection. They slipped away without explanation. No one argued with him. No one confronted him. They just adjusted, like the city had decided to move around him instead of with him. Harlem didn't need instruction. It was understood instinctively. This wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, about reminding a man that a badge didn't make him untouchable. It made him visible. And visibility cuts both ways. Bumpy understood something the cop never would. Power didn't need to announce itself. Power worked best when it felt inevitable, when people made choices thinking they were their own, not realizing the path had already been set. Businesses stopped cooperating, not rudely, respectfully. Papers went missing. Tips dried up. Cases stalled without anyone obstructing them directly. The cop's reputation shifted before he did. Inside the precinct, The laughter stopped. His stories stopped landing. He wasn't invited into conversations anymore, just tolerated at the edge of them. Promotions slowed. Trust thinned. No one said why. That was the genius of it. There was nothing to fight, nothing to arrest, no law broken. Just a man slowly discovering that isolation hurts more than opposition. And through all of it, Bumpy stayed calm. He still greeted people the same way, still listened more than he spoke, still handled business without urgency. His restraint became the lesson. You could strike him, you could embarrass him, but you couldn't force him to become small. And the longer the cop waited for retaliation, the clearer the truth became. The retaliation had already happened. The cop died the way men like him usually do, quietly. No headlines, no ceremony, no last-minute forgiveness written into the story. Just a date, a place, and a room that stayed mostly empty. The funeral home smelled like polished wood and stale flowers. Chairs lined up in perfect rows, waiting for bodies that never arrived. The flag was folded right. The uniform was pressed. Everything looked the way it was supposed to, except the people. 2 officers showed up, not late, not early, just enough to say they came. They stood near the back, hands folded, eyes forward, careful not to look around too much, because looking around meant noticing who wasn't there. No brass, no partner, no one from the neighborhood he'd worked so hard to dominate. Respect hadn't followed him into the room. Outside, Harlem moved on. Stores opened. Kids ran past stoops. Life stayed loud and breathing. No one stopped their day to talk about the funeral. No one needed to. The message had already been delivered. Somewhere else in the city, Bumpy Johnson sat at a table, calm as ever. No celebration, no satisfaction on his face, just the steady presence of a man who understood outcomes better than emotions. He hadn't wished the cop dead. He hadn't pushed him there. He'd simply let the truth finish its work. Because legacy doesn't care about uniform. It cares about how many people show up when you're gone. The cop had worn authority loudly, but he'd never earned loyalty. And loyalty is the only thing that fills a room when the noise finally stops. Harlem didn't talk about the funeral. That's how you knew the lesson had landed. There were no warnings passed down, no speeches on street corners. No one needed to explain what had happened or why it had happened the way it did. The story moved the way real stories move, quiet, selective, carried only to the ears that needed it. Bumpy Johnson never took credit. He didn't correct rumors, didn't confirm anything. If his name came up, he let it pass through the room without catching it. Power, to him, wasn't something you grabbed. It was something people handed you when they trusted your restraint. That trust was his real inheritance. Men who once believed in noise learned to lower their voices. Outsiders learned to watch before acting. And the neighborhood learned, again, that violence wasn't the sharpest tool in the room. Control was. Bumpy's authority didn't come from fear of what he might do. It came from certainty about what he wouldn't do unless he had to. That distinction mattered. It kept the streets from boiling over. It kept children safe walking home. It kept disputes contained instead of contagious. That was his legacy. Not bodies, not headlines. Balance. The cop had tried to humiliate him publicly, tried to turn power into a performance. Bumpy answered by refusing to perform at all. And in that refusal, the city chose sides without being asked. Years from now, people wouldn't remember the slap in detail. They wouldn't remember the room or the exact words spoken. They'd remember the result. They'd remember who stayed standing without raising a hand. That's how real power survives time. Bumpy Johnson understood something most men never learn. You don't need to strike back to win. You need to make sure the world responds to you. And Harlem always did.